Hello, welcome to the Examining a Paragon Pathfinder Installation Learning Guide. I'm Gordon with the Education Services Department at Juniper Networks. Let's get started. After completing this learning guide, you will be able to examine a Paragon Pathfinder installation. I'm kind of new to Kubernetes, and Paragon Pathfinder helped me learn it. I was familiar with Docker. I understood the concept of containers. Paragon Pathfinder functions are provided by a series of container-based applications that are managed by Kubernetes. The containers are organized into pods. A pod can have one or more container applications in them. When you install Paragon Pathfinder, not only are there Paragon Pathfinder pods, and there are some common pods that provide common services for any Paragon automation application that you may have installed. Services like storage or interfaces or inter-process communication mechanisms. And so you'll have some common pods, but you'll also have some pods that are related specifically to Paragon Pathfinder. And the purpose of this learning guide is kind of examining those pods. The primary resource I use to learn the different pods and the different containers and information about them is a Kubernetes utility called kubectl. And it's a command line utility, and so the issue with any command line utility, right, is I've got to learn what to type. And so a great place to start when you're getting started and don't know what to type, use kubectl -help, and it will list options for you. So for example, I can run kubectl, run or create, but now what do I type? If I do kubectl create, and that's not a complete command, I can run kubectl create -help, and it will show me the options for the kubectl create command and what type of Kubernetes would return when I entered the command. And so you'll use the help to kind of enable you to cobble together complete commands that can return you information about your Paragon Pathfinder installation. I'm going to connect to a controller now, and we'll run some of these commands. I've established a secure shell connection to the primary node of my Kubernetes cluster that has Paragon Pathfinder installed. I'm going to run the kubectl command. Remember I mentioned the -help command option. To help you understand, I'll scroll up a little bit, what commands are available for this utility, and where we'll spend the most of our time in this learning guide is the kubectl get option, because that will retrieve us information about the pods and the containers that make up our installation. So pods in the Kubernetes are organized by namespace. So if I run a kubectl get, one of the options available to me is namespaces, and I can see all of the namespaces that are used to organize the pods of my installation. And what's important for me for this learning guide is the pods for Paragon Pathfinder and also Paragon Planner are organized in the North Star namespace. Paragon Pathfinder was previously called North Star. And so you'll still see some legacy components of that. And if you wanted to view the pods in the North Star namespace, you could say kubectl get pods and use the -n option to specify the pods for a particular namespace. And we were interested in the North Star namespace. So I'm going to hit enter. And so here are all of the pods that provide Paragon Pathfinder and Paragon Planner services. You'll see with the output of this command the name of the pod, how many container applications are inside of that pod. So for example, in the BMP pod, there are 3 containers present, and thankfully 3 of them are running. One thing you'll need to understand about pod names is you can connect to pods to execute commands, you can retrieve logs from pods, you can return or examine detailed information about pods, but those kubectl commands require the pod name. And so a pod has a couple different parameters. For example, this is the BMP pod, and it's always the BMP pod, but each time this pod is launched or restarted, the values after the dash, these ID values, will change. And that's important because if you run a kube control command and try to name a pod, and that pod is restarted since you last viewed the name, the command will fail. So just be aware of that most of the pods will have these ID values after them. And so those values will vary, okay? So there's a list of the pods. Now, I said this pod, the BMP pod, has 3 containers inside of that. Well, what are the containers? What are the parameters for those containers? Well, let's run another command. I can run a kube control describe pods, and then I need the name of the pod. So let me copy that. Remember, that's why I was mentioning that these ID values can change. And I need to specify the namespace that it's in. So I'm going to add the -n option again. Now, there's a lot of output in this command, so I'm sorry, but I want you to see what you can learn from this, right? So let me scroll back up to the top of this output. Here's our kube control describe command. Here's the name of the pod, the namespace that it's in, the IP address of the worker node that this pod is running on, any type of labels, the internal IP address that's been assigned to this pod. Other pods can communicate with the services in this pod by sending data to that IP address. And then here's the individual containers. Remember, there were 3 containers that were members of this pod. One of them is the BMP, the BGP monitoring protocol service. Here's the ID for that container, where the container image was pulled from, where's the Docker registry, what ports is this service listening on. I also have a syslog container. And what's pretty important for folks that are running Paragon Pathfinder is this is the container routing protocol daemon, the CRPD that pairs with a router in your network using BGP to discover network topology. That's a very important pod, and BMP retrieves the routes and forwards them to the topo server, right? And I can see all of this using these basic kube control commands. So another kube control, and one that's very important to me when I first arrive, it's an installation and I don't know all the components. You can run a kube control get nodes command, and it will show you information about the components that make up your actual Kubernetes cluster. For example, this is the controller node. In a Kubernetes installation, you'll have a controller node, and then you have some worker nodes. The controller node schedules the pods, assigns the pods to worker nodes to run based on scheduling parameters that you define. You'll normally have more than one controller node from the Department of Redundancy department, but in a lab environment, I can get away with this, right? The pods inside of a particular namespace provide different services. So a good command is a kube control get service. In the North Star, show me all of the services provided by the pods in the North Star namespace. This is valuable information for me to have from a troubleshooting perspective because it lets me see the IP addresses and ports that the different services are listening on. So if I need to connect, for example, to a Paragon Pathfinder installation. For example, the Path Computation Element Protocol, PCEP, is used to discover label switch paths, provision, monitor, maintain label switch paths. But I need to configure my MPLS Edge routers to peer with this PCEP service, and that's provided by the North Star Path Computation Element Server service. I would configure my clients, their PCEP server is 192.168.115, and I need to send that traffic to this address at TCP port 4189 because Paragon Pathfinder is listening at this address and this port for PCEP connections, and it would forward it to the internal IP address of the pod at a different port. So it's kind of like a proxy service, right? And so you'll need this type of information when you're configuring and integrating Paragon Pathfinder into your network environment. What are, for example, my BGP service? right? This is how I discover network topology. I use PCEP to discover MPLS LSPs, but I need to discover the nodes and the links that make up your network. I can see that the BGP service does not have an external IP address. What this means is the BGP service on Paragon Pathfinder, you can't establish a session to it. It doesn't have an external IP address, so it can be reached from outside the pod. What this means is the BGP service on Paragon Pathfinder initiates the BGP session to a router on your network. So it doesn't accept connections, it establishes them itself. Just help me understand the different parts and pieces and addresses and how these different services and pods and containers function, right? So the kubectl command, very, very handy. And if you can just kubectl get -- help to get yourself started. In this learning byte, we examined a Paragon Pathfinder installation. Thank you very much.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Networks Certification Program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.